And we're live. Welcome back, everyone, to This Week at Work, where we bring you the latest trending news on all things the workplace, organizations, the future of work. As always, I'm joined by my partner in crime, Matt Burns. How are you, my friend?
I'm better rested than you are today. I can't believe you're doing this after yesterday.
I know. If you didn't catch the HR Leader Summit, make sure you check it out. We'll post a link in the in the comments section wherever you are. Yeah, for a 6-hour live stream. 4,000 HR executives from across the world. And yeah, I feel like I'm still like mentally recovering. I don't recommend anyone does a 6-hour live stream, and also massive thank you for you, Matt, for all of your support and stepping in. It was such a great way to end the day as well, right?
Yeah, what a great panel.
Yeah, it was so good. I like the fact that I always like the panels where not everyone agrees. It's my favorite. And I'm like, I actually disagree with you. Great. Let's have a chat about that as well.
Well, for those who weren't yesterday, we had a really great discussion regarding hybrid work and the ability to be working from the office or working from home. And we had two extremes. We had one individual that runs an organization that obviously is purporting that you can work from home and you can be totally flexible, and that's a completely acceptable modality for work. And then we had some senior executives in HR that clearly work for more traditional companies where they have a bias towards being at least partly in the office. So to hear that conversation was great as a fly in the wall. And like most things in the world, the answer kind of falls somewhere in between.
The answer falls somewhere in what works best for you and your individual organization. There's no one size fits all as well. And it was also quite divided in the chat, because I was watching the chat feed go by, even though it was a million miles an hour. But everyone was like, well, it really depends. And it's true. It depends on your company, your industry, your culture, your country. We spoke about, for example, some of the offices in Asia where it's less, the idea of actually, working from home full time is culturally a big step for many of those organizations. It really depends. And obviously, again, your industry, whether you're manufacturing, you've got a lot of factory-based workers. Remote, you can't be like, everyone work remote.
I don't want my doctor and nurse working from home. I'm in the hospital. When
you're in the hospital, you need surgery. Yeah. So as you can see for today's topic, kind of goes quite nicely from yesterday, to be honest. We're talking, interestingly enough, we didn't have any of the panels talking about the recession, but every single panel it came up, interestingly. So throughout the entire day, whether it was our people analytics panel or our D&I panel, whatever it was, somehow this conversation around the pending recession has come up. And I think we're already seeing it massively in the US right now. I think inflation's, they say, 10%, but in reality it's more like 20, 30% because the metrics of the way they measure it so out of date. I think the interest rates have gone up now, right, to like 6% or something along those lines. And I think in the UK, we also just put our interest rate, Bank of England just put their interest rate up as well. So the signs are all there. And I think everyone's already seen the headlines over the last couple of weeks with companies like Facebook, Uber, Netflix, the list goes on, who are cutting jobs. So I feel like it's kind of, people say, are we going into a recession? I think we're already here. I personally think we're already in a recession right now.
HR is here because, as you know, Chris, any of these big activities and organizations, it's HR who's usually leading the charge on these things. So oftentimes we're behind the scenes working with our finance and operational partners to reconcile kind of our next steps. So a lot of the times HR will be a quarter ahead of the rest of the business working towards a future state. And I'm not surprised to hear that most of my HR colleagues are talking about at least the potential of a recession and then what a recession could look like and building out different scenarios. And I think you're going to see more and more of that chatter as it works its way through the rest of the organization.
Yeah. Many of them offline as well, just telling me to get the amount of emails and inbound requests they're getting and concerns from leaders is kind of like gone through the roof. They're feeling it first. So I suppose the question we want to talk about today as well is, what does this mean for employees, the future of work, where we are now to where we're going. And there's a few things that when we first said we were going to talk about that just came to mind for me. I think that over the last 2 years, workers have gained considerable leverage, I think. Sort of that balance has shifted massively. And now the demand of better wages, benefits, work from home, flexibility, it's gone through the roof. And especially with the labor market and skill shortage, that also compounded. So it's really, we've had it good as employers for a few years, but I think the recession is going to really lead, and we're already seeing it, to slower job growth. We've mentioned companies like Facebook, Uber, Netflix are already pulling back already. And I feel like this is going to lead to that bargaining power shifting back. The dynamic's going to shift back. I think we're already seeing, I saw some data today with 2 job openings for every unemployed person in a current labor market. So I do think despite all of that, employees should still be able to do okay during the pandemic. But I suppose that depends on what are your skills. Are your skills recession proof? It's something I've been talking about my friends about. It's like looking at your skill set and be like, are your skills recession proof? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about that.
Well, it's a lot of factors. And I think you're wise to point out that there was a pendulum swing during the pandemic where, let's be clear, this isn't some altruistic measure. Out of necessity,
yes,
organizations allowed their employees to be more flexible and work from home.
Of course.
And that a lot of leaders during that time went kicking and screaming, as you know. And we got to a place where in a majority of organizations, again, dependent on the nature of their operation, people had greater flexibility. And now that things have returned back to some degree of normal, of course, pre-recessionary, there was this tension around, do we go back? And we heard voices, we talked about Elon Musk a few weeks ago, Chris, and his, basically statement that people will work from the office, and that is an expectation at Tesla, barring a few exceptions. We heard other things from, Wall Street in terms of their preference around, people working from the office. And then we also heard that tension, that pushback from employees and other organizations saying, well, actually, no, we were fully productive during this period of time. In some cases, our organization saw record financial results. So there really is no business rationale to have us come back to the office. And with a recession, I think you're going to see a rise of more conservative views around business, and people will recede to what they're more comfortable working in. And in a lot of cases, that means working from the office. Yeah. So I think you're right. I think it is a matter of skill sets, but it's also a function of how does the organization and its leaders feel best served to mitigate for the risk. So if there's this issue, a lingering trust issue or lingering concerns about productivity for people that are in a more dispersed environment, I think you're going to see organizations claw back some of that flexibility in service to bringing people back into the office, believing, and I think in most cases falsely, that it's actually going to drive more performance. My concern, if I was an HR leader in those organizations, is that if we swing the pendulum back too far, what's that going to do to our regrettable attrition numbers? Because going into a recession, the last thing I need as an HR executive is a significant amount of people leaving the organization, and with them, that institutional brain drain, that loss of culture, not to mention the additional costs of having to fill vacancies, and then get the new individuals up to a degree of productivity. So this is a really complicated issue, and I'd be interested to see how certain organizations play this out in the coming weeks and months, because I think the tendency is in the short term is that when there's risk, people want to button things down, they want to be more conservative, and they may look more at the shorter term and not necessarily the longer term. So I would counsel people to look at that medium to longer term as they're making decisions, because this isn't necessarily about the next quarter. You got to think about this in terms of the next fiscal year and beyond.
Yeah. I'm seeing a lot of people talk about this being very different to any type of recession before, because we've not only have we got the rise in inflation, we're obviously increasing in interest rates, but the interest rates, normally if you rise interest rates, you can manage the inflation, but it's got so out of hand that they would almost have to double, quadruple the interest rate in order to get it back. So a lot of people are scared that we're going to go into a Great Depression. as it were, that we were before.
Yeah, we've got a question kind of related to that from Antonia Bartels, who says, would love to hear your thoughts on the role of outplacement and career transition in supporting employees impacted by redundancies.
Matt, over to you, that one.
Yeah, it's a great question. So for those who aren't familiar with the term, outplacement is the support that organizations provide to employees who have left the organization. Yeah. That could be resume writing skills, interviewing skills, career advice. It's how do you help somebody land more softly after they've left the organization? And as an HR executive, this is a question that comes up anytime you're going to exit an employee, whether it's for cause or not for cause. And then there's obviously a budgetary implication to that, but there's also what's our core values as an organization to do that. Chris, one thing I'm really proud of is that I worked for companies that, let's be fair, were more fiscally restrained, or at least took a more conservative posture around how they spent their money. And at the same time, I made the business case in every instance that we needed to invest in outplacement, because how we treat employees after they leave the organization is really, really important. We may want to bring them back at some point in the future. Yeah. They certainly are customers and they're advocates. And in today's social media landscape where everybody has a platform and a voice, the last thing I want to be is perceived to be treating employees unfairly, in spite of the fact that their separation might be necessary. I mean, I think we all understand that businesses ebb and flow, and that unfortunately we live in an era now where you no longer have 30-year job security, that you could lose your job by no fault of your own. And how you treat people in amongst all of that, I think, is critically important, because again, looking at that longer picture, you have to consider the impacts of saving what could be a few $1,000s for somebody that ultimately could be an ambassador for your company. So I think it's a really, really good question. And I know we're going to see examples of this, Chris, where companies don't get this right, 100%. Where they're going to try and cut dollars and save pennies and take the approach of, well, somebody's going to leave the organization, so I'll pay them their required legal obligations in terms of payouts, and that'll be it. And they'll try and attach it to recession or a broader fact. That being said, people remember long after they leave how you've treated them. And I'd be very careful about taking I'll call it a cheaper approach to this. So I think it's an interesting question that people should be considering. And one thing I would suggest is you build this into your budget for separation. So if you're an organization that's going to be exiting people from the organization and therefore reducing wages in the short term, you can offset some of that savings by making a small, modest investment in outplacement to, again, feel good about how you've treated people on the way out of the organization.
It's also like, because I've seen so many companies, and we're seeing that it's not just the small companies that are affected. If we just mentioned some huge global businesses that are doing it, we also saw recently with the drop in crypto. Many of the big crypto companies are laying off large portions of their business as well. But just as quickly, when we come out of this, they're going to be they're the same people that are going to be reaching back out to those employees and trying to rehire them. You've got to think about the cost of that. So if you don't do this up front and take the time, like you just described, when you come back to, hopefully they're becoming a boomerang employee or someone you want to rehire, the cost is going to be far greater if you do it later down the line.
Well, you mentioned before skill sets. Some of these skill sets are really hard to find in the labor market right now. That's true, yeah. So you don't want to create an environment where people are treated differently. So I'm not suggesting that you treat full stack developers better than accounts payable clerks. And if I had a team that was a technology organization that leaned very heavily on skills that are very hard to find in the market, I might ask myself, is separation the step that we have to take? We saw many examples, Chris, during the pandemic where organizations did things like roll back wages for the executive teams to try and save money and therefore keep more of their employee base. We saw examples of people taking 4-day work weeks or 3-day work weeks to reduce their salary by 20%, 40%, again, to retain the employee in that environment. The easy thing to do, and I say easy, and I don't mean that in a emotional or moral way, but the easy thing to do financially is to cut a resource or cut resources, save the money, and then wait for a better day. And to your point, if this springboards back in 6, 9, 12, 15 months, and you've treated your employees on the way out not very well, don't be surprised if not only they won't come back, but in their communities of friends and contacts and social networks, if they tell their story and therefore it pollutes the water for your future recruitment efforts as well. So it's a much bigger picture than simply, again, saving money for the next quarter around wages.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think despite everything we're talking about, there's always going to be that moment where companies are still going to be aggressively competing for that talent. Regardless of a recession, depression, COVID, crisis, there's still going to be. So I don't think there's any turning back, regardless of any economic impact that happens. Workers are still going to benefit who have those particular skill sets that are in high demand.
I totally agree with you. And I also think it's wise to point out that from a broader societal perspective, we have to keep in mind that we talk about recession and it feels all doom and gloom and it feels like it's terrible. There are many organizations, I've worked for a few, that actually excel in recessions.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think about organizations like Walmart, they perform better during recessions than they do during boom markets. I think about, if you're in different commodities like food, the food market performs really, really well. When people go through a recession, they reduce the amount of discretionary spending. Food in most cases is not discretionary. So you might not go to fancy restaurants as often. You might not buy very expensive clothing and electronics and do as much travel, but you still got to feed your family. You still got to pay your rent. You still have to have electricity and cable, and in our cases, a Wi-Fi connection. So there are certain industries that are, in this case, a bit recession proof, or at least experience less recessionary pressures. And it's not going to be evenly spread. So it's not going to be spread evenly around the world. It's not going to be spread evenly across industry, and it's not going to be spread evenly across roles. So while, again, the broader landscape looks quite pessimistic, I would caution people about being overly down about what's going to happen. In a lot of cases, this is going to feel like uncomfortable, but it's not may affect you or your organization directly.
Yeah, no, you are right about that. And also these waves are inevitable. I saw, what was it? I think 40% of all dollars were printed in the during lockdowns. 40% of all dollars were printed. Trillions of dollars flooded into the market. What did people think that was going to happen? If you look at any of the companies that blew up during those times, like Zoom, that went through the roof. Just Google Zoom right now. Look at their share price; it's gone through the floor, and many, many others. So it was inevitable. We need a reset. Also, on a personal note, the housing prices of housing has gone through the roof over the last few years. It's unattainable for the average person. So we need that reset in the real estate market as well, which we're already starting to see as well. So there is a lot of positives that come out of this. It's just unfortunate. It's normally the everyday blue collar worker at the bottom that suffer the most. I think that's because those people. I can't remember the exact statistic, but I remember being shocked by it the other day. The amount of, I think it was something along the lines of like people making over £100,000 a year. 60% of them were living paycheck to paycheck. And I was like, what? They're making over 100K a year and 60% of them are working paycheck to paycheck. And, as soon as if you're on a variable rate mortgage, for example, when the interest rate doubles, how are you paying your mortgage payment? So I kind of worry about those. And then are there companies going to help provide any financial support? I know some companies have things in place to do that. But that's also, many employees now are going to turn to their company and be like, help me.
Well, and it makes the case for remote work even more compelling, because if you're in a real estate market like San Francisco or New York City, or where you live in London or I live in Vancouver, when I can't buy a home in Vancouver for less than $1.5 million,
yes, exactly.
How do you expect to attract workers that are earning even just $100,000 salary? I mean, Chris, I was having this chat with my mother last week or the week before last, and we were having a conversation around affordability, and in her bubble, she had a hard time grasping what was happening. And I explained to her in terms that she could understand, which was 40 years ago when my father and mother bought their first home together before I was born, they actually bought two houses on the same street with a single salary. My father's police officer, middle income salary. Today, two police officers can't afford to buy one home.
Yes.
That's the nature of how fast things have grown in terms of the inflationary prices. And again, certain people have benefited from that growth. I have many friends and colleagues who have bought second homes, third homes, vacation homes. They've Airbnb'd them out. They're making passive income on those properties. And if they weren't more cautious about the terms in which they did that lending, then they're going to be impacted negatively by this shift. So it's to your point, Chris, it is ultimately a major wealth transfer that's happening right now. And it does affect the broader economic landscape, does affect employment insofar as if I'm an employee and I want to earn a fair living and I want to live a good, balanced life, I might choose to live in a secondary or tertiary market, not in one of these big major cities, because I want a higher standard of living that feels much more like it was 30 or 40 years ago than to be in London making £100,000 per year and struggling paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah, you're right. It's interesting as I was speaking to my grandma the other day, and they bought their house for, I think it was like £40,000, and it's like £700,000 now. I was like, how much? And you're right. She worked in a sugar manufacturing company, very low level wage, and could afford to buy a house back then as well. How times have changed. I saw some data from SHRM actually, which I want to share, which kind of shocked me a little bit. They said that before the pandemic, about 10% of US workforce worked fully remote, according to their SHRM data. By the end of 2024, they expected that number to go to 20%, which I thought was quite low, actually. So they're still predicting that 80% of workers will return to the office in 2024. What are your thoughts on that? Because I thought it'd be a lot higher in terms of the remote segment of that. No, you're not surprised by that?
No, fully remote is a different conversation than hybrid. So I think fully remote requires a different degree of intentionality in terms of the workplace organizational design. And I also think that it's not what the majority of employees want for themselves either. I can speak for personal experience that when you're working alone for months, if not years on end, it can become a pretty lonely existence. And even though you get lots of conversations over Zoom, or in our cases, even virtual reality, it's just not the same as being in the same space as other people. And a lot of what attracts, especially younger workers, Chris, into the workplace is the opportunity to learn and grow in their organizations. And that is impacted if you're in a more dispersed environment. They don't get those colloquial conversations around the water cooler. They don't get the coffee chats. They don't get the drinks after Friday afternoons.
They don't get the inside scoop into what's happening.
They don't get the inside scoop. They don't get to build influence or build relationships to the same degree that they otherwise would. Whereas you see employees that are more in the twilights of their career, maybe that 55 plus category, where been there, done that. They're not at this point motivated necessarily by upward progression. They're looking to contribute back. And in those cases, they may be more open to a remote environment because their life is pretty set. I'm making big generalizations here, but they're backed up by data. Depending on the composition of your workforce, remote only doesn't make sense for a majority of workers, and it doesn't make sense for a majority of organizations. So I'm not surprised to hear that the number will only double over the next several years. I would be interested in seeing the number of people who worked hybrid, because I think that number
that's what I want to see.
Ballooned exponentially.
Yeah.
And related to that, we have a question from Derek Wenish, who asks, what ways do you recommend advancing the engagement of remote employees to reduce retention and stretching your organizational culture?
You mean increase retention?
I assume he means increase.
Yeah, he doesn't want to reduce. Hopefully, he doesn't want to reduce retention.
That's a unique way of reducing your workforce before a recession.
How do we reduce the retention during? I think it's the other way around, right?
Must be.
That was a topic that came up quite a lot in the panel at the end of the summit yesterday. And one of the ways, so is it making sure that you can retain people that work in hybrid? Was that what you mean by that?
Yeah, and I guess advancing engagement in general.
Yeah, I feel like there's some good things that came up. Matt, you made some good points, but I think one of the things that I took away was making sure that you can build those communities for those people that are working virtually, and then be intentional about that. There was a conversation around having cohorts. So if you're working remotely or you're onboarding someone new, that you create cohorts that they join with, and you create networking activities and opportunities for them to connect. And actually that sort of the learning development path, they go on that journey together. So you're building the connective tissue throughout the organization, albeit virtually as well. I think that's a good way. Also, as a leader, you're gonna have to be a bit more intentional about making time and those moments with each of them one-on-one. There's no easy way of doing this. One-on-one, sitting down, scheduling time, and making sure that you're starting conversations with, how are you feeling? How are you today? understanding the whole individual as well. So there's a few things that I would mention. What do you think, Matt?
Well, we talked about it yesterday too, assigning a buddy. So I mentioned the generational differences, more mature workers contributing, assigning buddies to new workers. That's a key piece. I mean, Chris, what we do for organizations now is we actually journey map the employee experience. And unlike before, where we journey map a singular employee experience, now we'll journey map it for in-office employees, fully remote employees, and hybrid employees, because the conversation and context shifts ever so slightly and the activities will shift. So the easiest step for any organization would be to sit down and map out the steps that your employees will go through their life cycle across those 3 different modalities. And that will illuminate some of those pain points. And then I would also add that if you don't currently have measures and metrics to assess the efficacy of those inflection points, 7 days in, 30 days in, 90 days in, 180 days in, then establish those measures, simple SurveyMonkey free surveys, or leverage your existing employee engagement platform to gather that information, look for those pain points, and then spend your effort at those inflection points. That's how we would go about doing it, because the answer is we could espouse a whole bunch of different opportunities and thoughts around this. Every organization is a little bit different and can handle things a little bit differently, but by journey mapping that experience out, you're going to very quickly see where you may have some problem spots.
Yeah. And last thing, I think how we started that conversation was also invest in those middle managers, give them the training, the opportunities, the language, the questions, give them that. What did we didn't say toolkit. What did we change it to yesterday? We said something else, creating a toolkit for them, but someone said actually call it something else. I can't remember what it was now. It's like principles. Just kind of give them a toolkit. There's probably about.
Is this your soft key way of trying to push something that you said yesterday and just trying to be casual about
it? No, it wasn't.
It
wasn't. We said I think it's just giving give them the framework, a playbook. Yeah. Give your managers and leaders a playbook, because many of them have never managed in this environment before. I haven't. I still struggle with it and how I do it and stay connected with the team. So map that out, like Matt said. Give them a playbook and check in. Don't assume it's all going well and everyone's happy. Check in often and be intentional. I hope that helps.
Well, and we have this bias in HR to try and create a singular, consistent, equality-driven experience for people. It doesn't work anymore. You need to create some degree of personalization and customization. So I have managed a remote workforce, and I did before the pandemic. And I made a lot of mistakes in the first 6 months, Chris. I mean, I had a team of close to 30 people, and there was 2 people in my office. The other 28 were offsite. And I made a ton of mistakes because I tried to apply a singular approach to some people. I had colleagues who wanted to connect with me 3 times a week, half an hour, quick meetings, how's it going, conversations, really wanted me to be involved in the day-to-day. These are the same people that if we worked in the office together would have popped by my office every single day for a conversation. So they thought the 3 days a week for them was like they're relaxing what they normally would require, and yet they need that kind of daily interaction. I had other colleagues I worked with who were quite fine for me not to talk to them for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. So when I was asking them to come in for weekly meetings, they're like, can you just get off my back and stop micromanaging me? So by understanding the unique needs of your employees, at the end of the day, Chris, this is about outputs, not about inputs. If your employees are delivering upon their mandate, if they feel engaged, if they feel committed, if they're good team members, then you can tweak and you can spend times augmenting their experience to fit their needs, and yet at the same time, drive a broader mandate.
Yeah, that goes back to the point we mentioned yesterday about not copying, pasting processes that you had in person and virtually and expecting that just to work as well. I don't think it was even working face-to-face in many companies, let alone then copy and pasting that virtually and expecting that to work. I see so many companies doing that. Well, it worked in person, so of course it'll work online.
Well, it's easy. Yeah, it's easy to say I have a singular program. If you want an example of it, like performance management.
Yeah.
Like, can you think of a worse organizational program? No. You apply a single standard, and I think part of it, Chris, to be fair, HR teams in this case are resource constrained, huge expectations, and there's a compliance measure that has to occur. We need somebody's signature every year saying, did you agree to your performance rating? Do you agree to your pay increase? Yeah. The easiest way to undertake that activity is to create a consistent approach and manage to a single standard. Well, the world has shifted, the expectations have changed, and thankfully for us, technology has made it so much easier to provide a degree of customization. I'm not saying create complete chaos. I understand that's not practical for a majority of organizations. You may also be operating in an environment that doesn't allow for that. If you're in a collective bargaining environment, you have a contract. You have to adhere to the contract. That is a requirement. And if you can provide a degree of personalization in how you interact with people, in the same way you wouldn't go to a dinner party and treat everybody exactly the same way, you would approach different kinds of people with different topics and different conversations. You'd listen to understand, you'd build a relationship. You have to do the same thing with your employees. I know we're talking about very basic things, but Chris, every day I hear examples of this not happening.
No, it's not basic. If it was basic, everyone will be doing it as well, right? But it takes time. And again, it takes intentionality to sit down and want to understand the whole individual. Everyone's different. It's not easy to do it. There's no quick way of doing that. It's one-on-one, time-consuming conversations, but it's where the value is. So what does the impending recession mean for the future of work? To kind of wrap things up, personally, I think that regardless if we're going through a recession, companies are still going to have to compete for this talent. I still think that despite there may be a little bit of a shift in the balance, but I think at the end of the day, those companies that still prioritize well-being, focus on the wider purpose, and that prioritize their employees, they're going to win. They're going to come out of this successful. And as you quite rightly mentioned earlier, Matt, what's that saying? People will forget what you said, but they never forget how you made them feel. Something along those lines. Yes. That is the way people go about. If they do have to downsize, think about how you're doing that. Be intentional about how you're doing that as well.
Concordant with that last summing up, we'll end with a question from Ash Merchant, who also agrees that no matter what happens in the global economy, the issue of creating value at an employee level still reigns supreme. Can you give guidance on best mindsets to have for HR teams to encourage an atmosphere of creating value?
Well, Matt, this is all you've ever done for your whole career, so you can answer that one. That's literally what you do.
Well, I think at the end of the day, in this case, I think the most important conversations, aside from the ones with your employees, are with your senior leadership teams. And if I'm an HR executive, I'm having discussions with my CEO, my CFO, my CTO, my CMO, and I'm working with them to understand what they believe in the current landscape. And I'm really stressing the importance of taking the longer term view.
Yeah.
That it's very easy to take a knee-jerk reaction and just shut the doors, bring everybody back to the office, cut the workforce by 30%, let's hunker down and weather the storm. And some of those decisions will be an overreach and may end up hurting you in the long run. So as you said, Chris, in some cases, a workforce reduction may be inevitable, but being thoughtful about how you undertake it and being thoughtful about looking at that activity in the broader context of your next 1, 2, or 3 year plan, I think is absolutely essential in the sense of, in a lot of cases, value creation may not be upward value creation, but it could just be slowing the rate of value loss.
I think that's a good place to end. Thank you everyone for tuning in. As always, we're going to be back the same time every week, so make sure you follow myself and Matt on LinkedIn to be notified. Also, on each of our profiles, you'll be able to see there's a little notification bell now on LinkedIn. So make sure you hit that notification bell on Matt's page and my page. I think it's only on mobile at the moment. So if you go on our pages via mobile, hit the notification bell. So every time we're live on LinkedIn, you'll get a notification. Also, if you're not following Bento HR and HR leaders, also go follow those pages. But apart from that, enjoy the rest of your weekends, everyone, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, Matt.
Take care.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.